Well, we still have the problem that a lot of them are comfortable with the older technology they have because it's paid for and it's cheap. So they think in terms of the cost associated with technology, and they're not seeing that they really need to innovate. I wrote a report recently about why are there no drones in life insurance. We're just not seeing that leap of faith, that understanding that the world truly is changing at the most senior executive level. Now, that's not true across the board. There are very innovative CEOs out there, but there are still a number of companies that are comfortable with the way they've done it for too long.
The thing that they need to focus on, and I do think they talk about it, but acting upon the talk is always harder, is we serve tier 2 through 5 clients. Think of it as small to mid-sized ones. And they're not going to be able to compete across the board on every dimension with large-scale players, particularly as these large-scale players create branded small players that are well-staffed and resourced for the job. And so what they need to talk about is, where do I want to compete? Where will I do the digitalization? Am I prepared through having an appropriate policy administration system or front office technologies to have a distinctive offer that makes me attractive in a unique way? And that's a tough thing, because it means that you have to tell someone representing some function in the company that they're going to have average stuff, and that in another part of the company, that's where we're putting our bet on being different and seeking partners that can make us more effective differently.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there are a couple of things I think that fit into that category. One is that we are living in a period when we're facing some pretty significant demographic changes in both the United States and Canada. Today, we live in a world where we have almost approached the point where millennials as a generation will represent half the labor force. That will actually occur in 2020 in the United States. But what is another data point that I think is missing is that number is projected to rise to 75% by the year 2025. And if you unpack those numbers, what you find is that my generation, I'm a card-carrying baby boomer, but a younger member of that generation, the birth rate actually was not consistent across the entirety of the generation. The peak birth year actually was 1949, which means that those individuals today are 70. Beginning in 1958, so people who are roughly 60 today, the birth rate started to fall rather precipitously. And so by 1962, the birth year, the birth rate was actually down in the United States to what it was before World War II, so effectively Depression-era levels. So that means that you see a relatively rapid transition of baby boomers out of the labor force and a reduction of their percentage, and that means, of course, that millennials, as the largest living generation, rise in that space. So that's a very interesting mathematical problem, but the reality is that it actually means for insurance companies, they need to start thinking very differently about the kinds of products and services that they're going to offer in the future, because the individuals in that generation are not necessarily going to be looking for the same kinds of things that their older siblings or their parents did. So I think that's a fundamental issue. Related to that is the impact that that has on the labor market itself. Baby boomers and older Gen Xers had a tendency to stay in positions for extended periods of time. Millennials have a tendency to think about their career as made up of a series of job engagements, or tours of duty, if you will, that may last 3 or 4 or 5 years. And they've learned that in order to manage risk on their end, it's to their advantage to think about their career as those tours of duty. That has all kinds of implications for how people manage technology, how they manage the intellectual property inside of companies. And I think carriers have not yet really fully recognized what they need to do in order to be able to manage that human capital for themselves. I think another thing that they're just now beginning to come to grips with is this notion of the idea that the useful life of technology is becoming ever shorter. Right? And it's not that the technology, modern technology, isn't great, but it just is that the new technology makes things go out of phase, out of style, out of capability relatively quickly. And so we're going to live in a world where things that are 30 or 40 years old may actually have a pretty significant useful life in front of them, where things that we bought relatively recently don't. And so there's a bifurcation of the thought process around how you manage technology. And that has implications on the accounting side, because no longer can you think about buying something and then depreciating it for a particularly long period of time, 7 years, maybe longer in some cases, because it doesn't have a useful life, anything like that. So it needs to force companies to think differently and move more towards an OpEx model rather than a CapEx model. That's a fundamental shift, not in technology, but in the thought process that's internal to how carriers manage themselves. And so one of the things that we encourage our clients, typically the CIOs, the IT leaders in organizations, is to work very carefully and closely with their financial counterparts, because this isn't a pivot that you can make quickly. It is something that you need to make very deliberately, methodically, cooperatively, because it will fundamentally change how you manage organizations. And I think that realization is beginning to come through to companies, but I think they're going to need to have that realization much more quickly than they otherwise would, because it has a significant impact on the investments that they're making today.